New York City, 1931. The skyline glows with neon lights that flicker through clouds of cigarette smoke. Cars crawl through the streets like shadows, and in the backrooms of dimly lit clubs, men whisper one name with a mix of reverence and quiet fear: Lucky Luciano. He isn't the biggest, the loudest, or the most violent man in the room. But when he enters, conversations stop. Glasses are lowered. Eyes shift. Something in the air changes, not because of the threat of blood but because of the presence of power. This was the fear he created, the fear that didn't need a gun. In a world where crime had always been defined by brutality and bullets, Charles Lucky Luciano was something different. He was the architect of a new kind of underworld, one that traded chaos for order and violence for structure. While others ruled through terror, Luciano ruled through intellect, diplomacy, and an uncanny understanding of human psychology. He didn't need to shout to be obeyed. His calm voice carried more weight than any threat could. This story isn't just about the rise of a gangster, it's about the creation of a system that would change America forever. A system built not on force but on fear of the unseen. Luciano would become the man who professionalized crime, who turned the Mafia from a bloody street affair into a global business empire. To understand how he did it, you must understand the world he walked into. A world of chaos, betrayal, and desperate ambition. The 1920s had made men like Al Capone famous for their violence, but Luciano's genius was subtler. He understood that true power wasn't about how many men you could kill, it was about how many you could control. It was about creating a network where fear was psychological, not physical. Where loyalty wasn't demanded but engineered. And that's what made him different. Luciano's reign would be remembered not for the bodies that fell, but for the empire that stood. He made people believe that obeying him was safer than crossing him, not because he threatened them but because he didn't have to. His control was invisible, like the hum of electricity behind the city lights. This documentary begins not with a crime, but with a question. How does a man command fear without ever lifting a hand? How does he make killers, politicians, and businessmen all bend to his will, willingly, almost gratefully? As we journey through the life of Lucky Luciano, we'll uncover the psychology of power, how manipulation replaced muscle, and how one man rewrote the rules of both the underworld and the American dream. The camera lingers on his eyes in an old photograph, calm, unreadable, almost polite. But behind that composure lies a mind that saw human nature as a chessboard, every emotion, every weakness, a move waiting to be played. This is not the story of a criminal. It's the story of a strategist. A man who understood that to rule without violence, you must master something far deadlier: fear itself. The America that Lucky Luciano was born into was not yet ready for the kind of order he would one day bring. The underworld was a jungle, loud, brutal, and without rules. In the years before Luciano's rise, crime in New York was fragmented into dozens of small, ethnic gangs. Italians, Irish, and Jews each controlled their corners, their loyalty owed not to strategy but to blood and neighborhood. The city pulsed with tension, every alleyway hid a war. The Italian Mafia of the early 20th century was not an empire, it was a battlefield. The old Sicilian bosses, men like Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, carried with them the traditions of the old world: hierarchy through violence, respect through fear, and silence through death. Their power was ancient, personal, and fragile. To them, the Mafia was not a business, it was a code of honor sealed with blood and superstition. But New York was changing. Immigrants poured in, Prohibition had turned liquor into gold, and the old rules were breaking faster than the bottles being smuggled in through the docks. Gangsters weren't just thugs anymore, they were businessmen with guns. The demand for structure, for cooperation, was rising. Yet the men in charge still fought like medieval lords over streets, bars, and pride. The Castellammarese War, the bloody conflict between Masuria and Maranzano from 1930 to 1931, was the perfect symbol of this chaos. Bodies turned up in alleys, cars exploded, and loyalty meant survival, for a few more days at least. The war wasn't about ideas, it was about ego. Old men fighting over old titles in a new world they didn't understand. And in the middle of this storm stood a young, ambitious Luciano, watching, listening, calculating. He saw what others didn't, that violence was bad for business. That every dead man was a lost earner, every feud a distraction from profit. He realized that power built on bullets could never last, but power built on organization could outlive its maker. To Luciano, the Mafia was still living in the shadows of Sicily, bound by ghosts of honor and tradition. He believed America was ready for something else, an organized network free of old rivalries, designed to run like a corporation, efficient, profitable, and bloodless. But before he could create it, he had to survive the world that came before it, a world ruled by men who only knew how to kill. The streets of Little Italy were ruled by fear, but it was a primitive kind, loud, obvious, and short-lived. The kind of fear that came from a knife in the dark or a gun under a table. Luciano would soon replace it with something quieter, colder, and far more effective. He would take this world of chaos and remake it in his own image. The old Mafia believed power came from being feared. Luciano would prove that real power came from never having to remind anyone why. As the bodies of the Castellamarese war piled up, one thing became clear: the old way of doing things was dying. Luciano wasn't going to wait for it to collapse, he was going to bury it himself. This was the world before Lucky Luciano, a city bleeding from its own greed, an underworld desperate for a leader who could make sense of the madness. And from that chaos, the architect of modern organized crime was about to rise. Salvatore Lucania was born in 1897 in Lercara Fritti, Sicily, a small, dusty village where poverty was the only inheritance. When his family immigrated to New York, the Lower East Side was no paradise. It was a battlefield of survival, tenements stacked like tombs, alleys filled with kids who learned early that strength wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. It was here, in this crucible of hunger and hustle, that the boy who would become Lucky Luciano began to shape his mind for power. As a young immigrant, he learned two languages: English and the unspoken language of the streets. Every corner was a lesson, about loyalty, deception, and the price of trust. He wasn't the toughest kid, but he was the smartest. Where others fought for pride, Luciano fought for advantage. He noticed things: who owed money, who feared who could be bought. It wasn't violence that fascinated him, it was control. By the time he was a teenager, Luciano was already a part of the city's criminal rhythm. He ran errands, gambled, and organized protection rackets at school, not through threats but persuasion. He understood people's fears and used them as currency. The other boys followed him not because he scared them, but because he made them feel safe. That subtle distinction would define his entire empire later in life. His early alliances would shape American history. On the rough streets of Manhattan, Luciano met Meyer Lansky, a sharp-minded Jewish kid who shared his hunger for order. Together they saw beyond ethnic lines, something almost heretical in the gang world of the 1910s. They realized that business didn't care about blood or heritage, it cared about profit. That single insight would change organized crime forever. Then came Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, wild, fearless, and loyal to a fault. Where Luciano was calm and calculating, Siegel was impulsive and dangerous. Their friendship became a symbol of balance: intellect and aggression, vision and action. Luciano wasn't the strongest, but he knew how to surround himself with the right kind of power. He built a team, not a gang. His nickname Lucky came from surviving a brutal kidnapping by rival gangsters who beat and stabbed him before leaving him for dead. He lived, scarred and half-blind in one eye. But what truly survived that night wasn't just his body, it was his philosophy. He learned that fear couldn't protect you but respect could. From that point on, Luciano's power would come not from showing strength, but from appearing untouchable. In the years of Prohibition, the streets turned into gold mines. Alcohol was illegal, but desire never was. Luciano used his street smarts to move from small-time hustler to organized operator, forming networks that ran deeper than anyone realized. Where others saw a quick profit, he saw infrastructure: routes, connections, systems. He was building the foundation for something bigger than bootlegging. But beneath the charm and ambition, there was also calculation. Luciano was studying people the way a chess master studies the board: every move, every emotion, every betrayal noted. He understood that fear wasn't the same as hate. You could make people fear you and still have them love you. That was his gift, and his danger. By his early 20s, Luciano was already known in both the Italian and Jewish underworlds. He wore tailored suits, spoke softly, and carried himself like someone who had already made it, even before he had. That confidence, that calm authority drew people to him. He was still just a street kid from the Lower East Side, but in his mind he was already sitting at the head of the table. In the end, the rise of Lucky Luciano wasn't just about escaping poverty, it was about mastering a world that thrived on chaos. He had turned survival into an art, fear into a weapon, and human psychology into his greatest ally. The streets of New York had created countless criminals, but only one strategist. And as Prohibition fueled the city's hunger for profit, Luciano was ready, not to join the chaos but to control it. The boy from Sicily was no longer just surviving the American dream. He was about to rewrite it. By the early 1930s, New York's criminal underworld was reaching a breaking point. The Castellammarese War had torn through the Mafia like a fever, a civil war of ambition, betrayal, and blood. On one side stood Joe, the boss Masuria, an old-school gangster clinging to the ways of Sicily, ruling through intimidation and superstition. On the other was Salvatore Maranzano, a rival who fancied himself a Roman emperor reborn, obsessed with hierarchy and ancient codes. Between them lay dozens of bodies, and beneath them, a city gasping for stability. Lucky Luciano stood in the middle, young, ambitious, and tired of watching men die for nothing. He had served under Masuria, paid his dues, and learned the old man's ways. But what Luciano saw was inefficiency, a system choking itself on pride. Masuria's rule was built on fear, but it was the wrong kind of fear, reactive, emotional, and wasteful. Luciano wanted something cleaner, more modern, something that made sense in America. In 1931, Luciano made a decision that would redefine the Mafia forever. He would end the old world. But he couldn't do it with bullets alone. He had to play both sides, deceive both kings, and crown himself quietly in the aftermath. He reached out to Maranzano in secret, presenting himself as a double agent. Luciano offered to remove Masuria in exchange for peace and a new beginning. It was a bold move, treacherous on the surface, visionary underneath. Luciano was no longer thinking like a gangster. He was thinking like an executive orchestrating a corporate merger. The betrayal came in the spring of 1931. Luciano arranged a meeting with Masuria at a Coney Island restaurant, a quiet lunch between boss and lieutenant. They played cards, shared wine, and when Luciano excused himself to the restroom, gunmen entered the room. Masuria never made it out alive. The men who carried out the hit were handpicked by Luciano, a mix of Italian and Jewish gunmen including Bugsy Siegel and Vito Genovese. Their diversity was no accident, it was symbolic. The old Mafia had been divided by bloodlines. Luciano's new world would be united by business. With Masuria gone, the war seemed over. Maranzano declared himself boss of bosses, reorganizing the Mafia into a structured pyramid modeled after the Roman Empire, families, ranks, and absolute loyalty to him at the top. For a brief moment, it seemed Luciano's gamble had paid off. But power reveals itself in the details, and Luciano quickly saw that Maranzano was just another Masuria, more polished, perhaps, but just as arrogant. He preached modernization but ruled through fear. He called himself Don, demanded tribute, and spoke of cleansing the Mafia of outsiders, especially Luciano's Jewish allies. To Luciano it was déjà vu, another tyrant dressed in the language of progress. So he planned another revolution. This time he didn't ask permission. Luciano summoned trusted allies, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and others, and made a decision that would once again change everything. Maranzano had to go. In September 1931, only months after Masuria's death, Maranzano called Luciano to a meeting at his office. Luciano agreed, but he knew it was a trap. Maranzano had already ordered his assassination, planning to eliminate the last of his rivals. Luciano simply moved faster. That same day, 4 gunmen posing as government agents entered Maranzano's office. They disarmed his guards, marched straight to his desk, and killed him, swiftly, efficiently, without spectacle. The old world died in silence. In 1 year, Luciano had done what no one before him could. He ended the Mafia civil war and erased the idea of a single boss of bosses. For the first time, the underworld was leaderless and free. This was not just a coup, it was a transformation. Luciano had replaced the feudal structure of the old Mafia with something entirely new, a modern syndicate built on cooperation, not domination. Violence was still a tool but no longer the language of power. He didn't celebrate. There were no speeches, no declarations. His victory was measured not in the blood spilled, but in the silence that followed. The city was calm again. For the first time in decades, the Mafia wasn't fighting itself, it was preparing to do business. Luciano's rebellion was more than an act of ambition, it was a statement. He had killed not just 2 men but an idea, the idea that fear and tradition alone could rule the underworld. In their place he planted something far more dangerous, reason. The old guard had fought for thrones built on pride. Luciano built a boardroom instead, and every gangster, every family, every dollar that flowed through the city would soon answer to it. The revolution was complete. The old world was buried. And in its place, Lucky Luciano began building an empire that would change crime, and America, forever. With the deaths of Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, the old Mafia was gone, buried beneath the streets of New York along with the corpses of their outdated traditions. For the first time, the underworld had no boss of bosses. The throne was empty and lucky Luciano had no interest in sitting on it. He understood something the old guard never could. Absolute power was a weakness. It created targets, enemies and paranoia. What Luciano wanted instead was structure, a system that could outlast any one man. That vision became the Commission. It was 1931, and Luciano called together the most powerful mob leaders in America. They met quietly in a suite at the Waldorf Astoria, an irony not lost on anyone. A meeting of criminals in one of the city's most elegant hotels, discussing the future of organized crime as if it were a corporate merger. Around the table sat names that would become legends: Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, Meyer Lansky, and others representing the 5 New York families. Beyond them came delegates from Chicago, Cleveland, Buffalo, a nationwide council of the underworld. Luciano spoke plainly. There would be no more boss of bosses. No single man should command the Mafia. Instead, power would be shared among equals. A national syndicate, run like a business, with each family maintaining autonomy but answering to a central body for arbitration and policy. He called it the Commission. It was democracy in its most dangerous form. Every family would have representation. Disputes would be settled through discussion, not bloodshed. Territory, investments, and operations would be divided rationally. Killings without approval would be forbidden. Luciano transformed the Mafia from a loose collection of feuding gangs into a boardroom of businessmen, criminals, yes, but organized, efficient, and quietly professional. It was a revolution not just in crime but in philosophy. The Mafia was no longer about revenge, honor, or blood oaths. It was about profit, order, and power through stability. Luciano saw the underworld as a machine, every cog serving the whole. Violence, he believed, was bad for business. It drew attention. It was wasteful. Better to control fear like a valve, to open it only when necessary and close it when the world was watching. The Commission's structure reflected his genius for balance. New York would have 5 families, Luciano's own, led by trusted lieutenants like Vito Genovese and Frank Costello. The Mangano, Bonanno, Prophesai, and Gagliano families would each control their own territories. Chicago would be represented by Al Capone's outfit, Cleveland by Mo Dalitz and others across the country. Luciano didn't rule over them, he coordinated them. It was power disguised as equality. Everyone had a seat at the table but everyone knew who had built it. Luciano didn't have to command. He simply created a system where his influence flowed naturally through loyalty, gratitude, and respect. The most brilliant part was that no one could take his place. If a boss was killed, the structure remained. Luciano had made himself indispensable not as a dictator, but as the architect. The Commission's first order of business was clear. The Mafia would expand its operations beyond bootlegging, anticipating the end of Prohibition. They would move into unions, gambling, narcotics, construction. Industries where money flowed in predictable, steady rivers. They would infiltrate legitimate businesses, build political connections, and buy silence where violence had once been the tool. For the first time, organized crime wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. The Mafia became an invisible corporation, with a leadership model that Fortune 500 companies would envy decades later. The public saw gangsters as thugs. Luciano saw them as shareholders. What made this transformation truly revolutionary was the psychological shift. Luciano understood that men feared unpredictability. By creating rules, he made fear controllable, predictable, something that worked in his favor. People could trust him because he was consistent. He didn't need to threaten anyone. His system did it for him. The Commission wasn't just about power sharing, it was about legitimacy. Luciano wanted to erase the line between the underworld and the surface world. He attended nightclubs with politicians, had dinner with judges, invested in legitimate enterprises through proxies. The Mafia no longer hid in the shadows, it learned to walk in daylight, dressed in silk and respectability. In creating the Commission, Luciano did more than organize crime, he Americanized it. He turned the Mafia into a mirror of capitalism itself, driven by profit, sustained by cooperation, and protected by fear. Behind every handshake was an understanding. Cross the system and it wouldn't be one man you'd face but an entire network. There was no single head to cut off anymore. Luciano had created something more enduring than himself. A structure of power that didn't rely on violence, only on the unspoken knowledge that it could still be used if necessary. The old Mafia had been a monarchy. Luciano's Mafia was a republic of crime, and like all great republics, it would last long after its founder was gone. In that sense, the Commission was more than an invention. It was Lucky Luciano's masterpiece, the blueprint of a silent empire where power didn't shout. It whispered. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano's empire stretched invisibly across America, a quiet network of influence that linked the backrooms of Harlem's speakeasies to the boardrooms of Wall Street. What had once been a patchwork of street gangs was now a coordinated enterprise. Crime had become an industry and Luciano was its CEO. Prohibition had been his training ground. Now, as it came to an end, he and his partners faced a new question. What happens to an empire built on illegal liquor when the liquor becomes legal? Most gangsters panicked, but Luciano didn't. He saw what others missed. Prohibition wasn't the source of wealth, it was just a product line. The real business was control. So he diversified. Under his guidance, organized crime evolved from a bootlegging operation into a complex network of investments and rackets. Gambling became a cornerstone. Luciano, through his partner Frank Costello, built connections to bookmakers, horse tracks, and underground casinos from New York to Miami. They fixed odds, laundered money, and created systems that ran smoother than many legitimate businesses. Then came labor racketeering, one of Luciano's most ingenious moves. The Mafia infiltrated unions across industries: trucking, construction, the docks. Through intimidation and strategic influence, they controlled who worked, who got paid, and who didn't. This wasn't about extortion anymore, it was about leverage. If a company wanted peace, they paid for it. If a politician wanted labor's support, they earned it. Luciano had turned the working class into a silent army that unknowingly served him. Behind it all was a methodical mind. Luciano understood that violence was a tool of the uncreative. Real power lay in persuasion, negotiation, and perception. He surrounded himself with men who knew how to blend crime with charm. Frank Costello, smooth, diplomatic, the prime minister of the underworld. Meyer Lansky, precise, mathematical, turning illegal profits into legitimate fortunes through offshore banks and casinos. Together they made the Mafia look less like a criminal gang and more like a multinational corporation. Prostitution, narcotics, and protection rackets remained profitable, but Luciano treated them like departments within a larger company. He instituted record-keeping, accountability, even performance expectations. The Mafia wasn't just feared, it was efficient. That efficiency made it terrifying, because it wasn't emotional, it was systematic. Luciano's control extended to the highest levels of politics and law enforcement. Bribes replaced bullets, and politicians who once condemned gangsters were now quietly meeting them in smoke-filled rooms. Luciano's influence reached into Tammany Hall, the heart of New York's political machine. Judges, cops, and city officials found themselves either compromised or complicit. It wasn't that Luciano wanted fame, he wanted insurance. Every man in power he helped was another man who couldn't afford to betray him. And through it all he maintained a code of elegance. He dressed impeccably, spoke softly, and carried himself like a gentleman. To the public he was a businessman. To the underworld he was untouchable. He didn't need to shout or kill to command obedience. His presence, calm, confident, deliberate, was enough. The most remarkable thing about Luciano's rule was that he made the Mafia respectable, even admirable in certain circles. The press called him the modern mobster. Hollywood began romanticizing gangsters, portraying them as clever antiheroes instead of brutal killers. In a twisted way, Luciano's charm helped rewrite America's perception of organized crime. Yet behind the glamour there was still danger. Every handshake carried an unspoken threat. Every favor came with a price. Luciano had created a system so disciplined that fear didn't need to be shown, it was understood. His power didn't depend on violence, it depended on belief. The belief that he was inevitable. That his reach was limitless. That every street, every union, every deal somehow traced back to him. It was a myth he quietly encouraged, a shadow that grew larger than the man himself. In the end, Luciano's greatest achievement wasn't how much money he made, but how seamlessly he blurred the line between criminality and legitimacy. His empire operated in the spaces between business and blackmail, respectability and ruthlessness, friendship and fear. He had done what no gangster before him ever could. He had made the underworld invisible. And in that invisibility lay his true genius. Because if violence was the language of old power, then silence was the dialect of the new. Lucky Luciano didn't just control crime, he professionalized it. He made corruption feel like commerce and fear feel like order. Under his hand, the Mafia became not just an organization, but an institution, a shadow reflection of America itself. Fear in Lucky Luciano's world was never about guns or death, it was about control. He understood, better than anyone before him, that the most effective kind of fear was invisible. It didn't come from shouting or threats, it came from uncertainty. From the quiet knowledge that crossing him would end you, though you might never see it coming. By the mid-1930s, Luciano had elevated fear to an art form. He made it sophisticated, efficient, psychological. His enemies and allies alike obeyed him not because they trembled at his name, but because they trusted his calm, and distrusted what might happen if he ever lost it. He didn't need to demonstrate power, he simply had to remind people that he could. To outsiders, it seemed impossible. How could a man rule the most dangerous criminals in America without spilling oceans of blood? But Luciano's strength was subtle. He mastered the psychology of influence long before the term existed. He learned how to make people want to follow him. When he walked into a room, he never raised his voice. He listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, every word felt deliberate, measured. His men described it as unnerving. He never cursed, never blustered, never made threats. But somehow, his quiet confidence carried more menace than 100 bullets. Luciano's genius lay in understanding human needs. Every man wanted something: money, respect, safety, status. He gave each man exactly what he craved, and in doing so, bound them to him. His fear wasn't rooted in punishment but in loss. The fear of losing his favor, his trust, his approval. In the world he built, being cut off from Luciano was a death sentence all its own. He rewarded loyalty generously, but betrayal was met with a cold, clinical precision. If someone had to be eliminated, it was done quietly, professionally, never as an act of rage but as maintenance of the system. He would often let others make the decision for him, ensuring his hands remained clean. People began to believe that Luciano's justice was inevitable, that disobedience carried a price written into fate itself. That was his true power, inevitability. Even his allies felt it. Frank Costello once remarked that Luciano could make you feel like he owned your future. Meyer Lansky called him the only man I ever met who didn't have to raise his voice to make people sweat. To Luciano, fear wasn't about terrorizing people, it was about designing an environment where defiance simply didn't make sense. He built systems to sustain this. The commission, his political allies, his network of lieutenants, each layer insulated him from direct conflict. Problems were handled before they reached him, and those who solved them did so out of devotion, not dread. He cultivated loyalty by making people believe they were part of something bigger, something stable, efficient, eternal. Even the way Luciano dressed and moved projected control. Tailored suits, silk ties, polished shoes, never flashy, never careless. His composure was his weapon. The image of a man who never panicked, never broke character, was more intimidating than any threat of violence. In private, he often spoke about power in abstract terms. You don't get respect by scaring people, he once told Lansky. You get it by making them believe you can do anything, and then not doing it. That restraint was his signature. Every time he chose not to retaliate, not to explode, not to draw attention, he grew more powerful. People feared what he might do far more than what he actually did. Luciano understood that predictable power was weak. He made himself unpredictable, unreadable. Sometimes he forgave enemies. Sometimes he erased them. No one ever knew which outcome awaited them, and that uncertainty kept the entire underworld in line. But this refined fear came with a psychological cost. It demanded constant awareness. Luciano had to anticipate betrayal before it happened, manipulate emotions before they surfaced. It was a game of chess played with human souls, and he rarely lost. His kind of fear wasn't loud. It didn't echo through gunfire or blood-stained headlines. It lived in the silence that followed his name, in the way men paused before speaking it, in the way they avoided his gaze when discussing business. He had created a climate of control so perfect that even when he wasn't there, people behaved as if he was. Luciano's rule marked a shift in the nature of power itself. The old Mafia believed fear came from violence. Luciano proved that real fear comes from psychology, from reputation, mystery, and precision. Violence was crude, fear was elegant. He ruled not by force but by presence. And in doing so he showed the world something chilling, that the most terrifying leader isn't the one who kills you, it's the one who doesn't have to. The underworld Luciano had built was vast, disciplined, and quiet, but beneath the surface cracks were beginning to form. Power, no matter how elegantly designed, always attracts envy. By the late 1930s, Luciano's empire was a network of uneasy loyalties, alliances bound by profit, tested by ego. And as every empire learns, the greatest threats rarely come from outside. They come from within. Luciano's closest allies were also his greatest risks. Frank Costello, the charming diplomat, Meyer Lansky, the strategist, Vito Genovese, the ambitious enforcer. Each owed their rise to Luciano, but each had their own ambitions. The system that had once unified the Mafia was now breeding quiet rivalries. Luciano had replaced the chaos of violence with the subtler chaos of ambition. Costello represented the smooth political side of the organization, the man who could speak to senators as easily as to mobsters. He believed in subtlety, diplomacy, and influence through respectability. Genovese, by contrast, was pure volatility, ruthless, power-hungry, impatient. He saw Luciano's vision as weakness, believing fear should be visible, not silent. Lansky, ever the realist, stood between them, loyal to Luciano but pragmatic enough to know that the underworld had no permanence. The tension among these men was more dangerous than any street war. It was a battle of philosophies. Intellect versus instinct, control versus chaos. Luciano's restraint had built the empire, but to some, it now looked like vulnerability. Genovese whispered to others that Luciano had gone soft, too friendly with politicians, too obsessed with appearances. He saw opportunity in Luciano's sophistication. But Luciano wasn't blind. He knew the balance was delicate, and he tried to maintain it with the same precision he had always used. Small gestures, careful diplomacy, constant awareness. He played mediator among his own lieutenants, making sure no one man grew too powerful. Yet even for a mind like his, control had its limits. Outside forces were also beginning to close in. Law enforcement had started to adapt. The press had turned organized crime into a national obsession, and ambitious politicians wanted their names attached to the fall of a kingpin. Chief among them was Thomas E. Dewey, a relentless prosecutor whose rise would soon become inseparable from Luciano's downfall. Dewey's focus on corruption, vice, and organized prostitution threatened to expose the delicate web Luciano had built between the streets and the upper class. As the government began turning its gaze toward him, Luciano's alliances became even more vital and more fragile. Every conversation mattered. Every friendship was suspect. The commission still held power, but whispers began to circulate that Luciano was losing his edge. Then came the betrayal that would define his downfall. In 1936, Dewey's office launched a full-scale attack on the city's prostitution rings, an operation that had long been under Luciano's indirect control. He didn't run the brothels himself, but the profits from them fueled his network. When arrests were made, the women involved began talking. Slowly, under pressure, names surfaced. And behind those names was one that shocked the underworld, Lucky Luciano. But what truly sealed his fate wasn't Dewey's investigation, it was betrayal from within. One of his trusted associates, a man named Cokie Flo Brown, and later several madams and intermediaries, cooperated with prosecutors. They claimed Luciano was the one pulling the strings. Whether those claims were true or exaggerated didn't matter. The myth of Luciano's invisibility was shattered. For years he had ruled through silence, diplomacy, and distance. Now that distance worked against him. He couldn't deny involvement without admitting the connections that had protected him for so long. Every favor, every alliance, every handshake became potential evidence. Behind the scenes, the once loyal Genovese began maneuvering, presenting himself as a possible successor should Luciano fall. Lansky, ever pragmatic, shifted to protecting his own interests. Costello stayed loyal, but even he could feel the tide turning. The walls were closing in. The law was hunting him from one side, ambition from the other. Luciano's empire, built on logic, respect, and quiet fear, was now suffocating under its own sophistication. For the first time, the man who had controlled everyone else was being controlled by circumstances. His gift had always been his ability to read people, to predict moves before they were made. But this wasn't a gang war, it was politics, publicity, and betrayal all at once. In private, Luciano remained calm. He still dressed elegantly, still smiled for the cameras, still projected the illusion of composure. But those closest to him began to sense it, a tension, a stillness too perfect to be natural. The architect of order was now trapped in the chaos he had once mastered. The commission, once his proudest creation, began to waver in his absence. The balance of fear and respect that had kept it stable depended on Luciano's invisible hand, and without it, the structure began to fracture. The hidden war, the one Luciano had always tried to prevent, had begun again. Only this time, it wasn't fought in the streets but in courtrooms, in backrooms, and in whispered promises of loyalty that no longer meant what they once did. Lucky Luciano had built an empire without violence. Now, the same silence that had once protected him was about to destroy him. The fall of Lucky Luciano didn't come with a gunshot in the night, it came with a knock on a hotel door. On the morning of April 1, 1936, detectives burst into his suite at the Waldorf Towers, one of the most luxurious addresses in Manhattan. There was no shootout, no chase, no chaos. Just a calm, impeccably dressed man, still half asleep, adjusting his silk tie as the police read the charges. It was almost poetic. The man who had ruled the underworld without violence was now being undone without a single shot fired. The arrest stunned New York. Newspapers exploded with headlines, "Luciano, Vice King, seized." And the myth of the untouchable Don began to crack. 4 years, Luciano had lived between two worlds, the underworld that feared him and the high society that admired him. Now both were watching as the mask came off. The charges were unprecedented. District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey accused Luciano of running the city's prostitution racket, not as a small-time player, but as its architect, its financier, its silent master. The evidence was circumstantial, the witnesses unreliable, but the optics were devastating. Dewey didn't just want a conviction. He wanted to destroy the idea of Luciano. As Luciano sat in his cell that night, the empire he had built so meticulously began to unravel. His associates scrambled. His allies, the ones who had promised loyalty, hesitated. In the world of organized crime, loyalty lasted only as long as power. And Luciano's power, for the first time, was in question. What made this moment so striking was Luciano's demeanor. He didn't rage, didn't plead. He knew this was a new kind of war, one fought with words, not bullets. He hired the best lawyers money could buy, dressed impeccably for every hearing, and smiled at reporters as if he were attending a business luncheon. The performance was deliberate. If Dewey was going to make a spectacle of him, Luciano would control the narrative. Behind the calm exterior, however, paranoia crept in. Luciano had always believed that his empire was immune to betrayal, that fear and respect had created something permanent. But as the trial approached, rumors reached him. Some of his own people were talking. The women arrested in Dewey's raids, prostitutes, madams, intermediaries, had begun to name names. They spoke of payments, connections, phone calls, meetings in the night. It was a web of half-truths and exaggerations, but Dewey was a master of optics. Each testimony painted Luciano as the shadowy mastermind of a citywide vice network. The more Luciano denied it, the more powerful the story became. And in the court of public opinion, story mattered more than truth. Inside the Mafia, whispers turned into fractures. Vito Genovese saw the storm as opportunity. He began quietly maneuvering to inherit Luciano's power, reaching out to other bosses and promising stability. Meyer Lansky, ever pragmatic, tried to keep operations running smoothly, but even he knew the structure couldn't survive without its architect. Frank Costello remained loyal, but his influence couldn't stop what was coming. For the first time, Luciano was alone, not because people had turned against him, but because they were too afraid to stand beside him. Fear, his greatest weapon, had turned inward. It isolated him, consumed him. Everyone in his orbit had learned from him too well. Survival came before sentiment. The trial that awaited him would not just be a legal battle, it would be psychological warfare. Dewey understood that breaking Luciano's myth was as important as convicting him. He wanted to prove that even the calmest, most calculated crime boss could be dragged into the light. And so, as Luciano waited for his day in court, the man who had redefined power faced the one thing he could never control: exposure. He had built an empire on invisibility, on staying untouchable, unknowable. Now, every headline, every witness, every photograph stripped away another layer of mystery. Luciano once said that fear worked best when people didn't know where it came from. But now he was the one surrounded by uncertainty, not knowing who had betrayed him, who was still loyal, or how far the truth would reach. The fall had begun not with violence but with words, and it was words that would finish him. The courtroom would become his battlefield, and Dewey his rival commander. But unlike the gang wars of the past, this was not about blood. It was about reputation, legacy, and survival. And for the first time, Lucky Luciano would discover that even the most carefully built empire can crumble, not from force but from exposure. He had outsmarted rivals, assassins, and old-world traditions. But there was one opponent even Lucky couldn't charm, threaten, or manipulate: the American justice system. And as the gavel prepared to strike, the man who ruled without violence was about to face a reckoning he couldn't escape. The trial of Lucky Luciano in the summer of 1936 was not merely a legal proceeding, it was theater. A carefully choreographed performance designed for newspapers, headlines, and the hungry eyes of a nation obsessed with crime. The courtroom became a stage, and at its center stood a man who had once ruled the shadows, now illuminated by blinding light. Thomas E. Dewey, the ambitious special prosecutor, had waited his whole career for this moment. To him, Luciano wasn't just a gangster. He was the embodiment of everything corrupt about New York. If Dewey could bring down the most powerful mafia boss in America, it would cement his reputation as the man who could clean up the city. For Dewey, this wasn't justice, it was destiny. Luciano entered the courtroom every day dressed like royalty, custom-tailored suits, silk pocket squares, shoes that shone like mirrors. He smiled for the press, whispered jokes to his attorneys, and looked every bit the composed businessman he claimed to be. He refused to act like a criminal. His presence was calculated. If the state wanted to make him the face of organized vice, he would counter by embodying sophistication. But beneath the calm exterior, the prosecution's case was relentless. Dewey paraded witness after witness, women from brothels, pimps, taxi drivers, hotel clerks, each claiming to have seen, heard, or received orders that traced back to Luciano. Many of them were unreliable, their stories contradictory, but together they formed a mosaic of guilt. To the public it looked damning. Dewey's genius wasn't in evidence, it was in narrative. He painted Luciano not as a thug but as an invisible emperor of sin, a man whose power reached into every backroom and bedroom of New York. He told jurors that Luciano had taken prostitution, once scattered and chaotic, and organized it like a business. This man, Dewey declared, pointing directly at Luciano, is the CEO of crime. For the first time in his life, Luciano had no control over the story. The courtroom was a trap of logic and performance, and he was the villain in someone else's script. He could not silence witnesses, intimidate jurors, or manipulate the press. Every trick that had once worked in the streets was useless here. The defense tried to discredit the witnesses, arguing that the testimonies were coerced or fabricated. Luciano's lawyers pointed out that there was no paper trail, no direct proof, no evidence linking him personally to the prostitution network. It should have been enough. But Dewey had the one thing Luciano had always relied on: fear, and now it was being used against him. Witnesses didn't testify out of loyalty to Dewey, they testified out of terror of Luciano. The very aura that had protected him for years now condemned him. Jurors didn't need to see evidence, they only needed to believe in his legend. As the days turned into weeks, the trial became a national spectacle. Reporters filled every seat, photographers crowded the steps outside. The headlines were merciless: Lucky's luxury life ends, Vice King on trial, the Don who sold sin. Inside, Luciano maintained his composure. He whispered strategy to his lawyers, sometimes even smiled when a witness contradicted themselves. But those close to him noticed a subtle shift, the faint exhaustion behind his eyes, the occasional clenched jaw. For the first time, Lucky looked tired. When the closing arguments arrived, Dewey delivered his masterpiece. He told the jury that this was their chance to strike a blow against the hidden world that had poisoned their city. Luciano is not a man, he said. He is a system, a disease that spreads where law and decency fall silent. It was rhetoric, not proof, but it worked. On June 7, 1936, after nearly 9 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom was silent. Luciano sat motionless, his expression unreadable. The foreman stood and read the verdict: guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. Luciano didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his tie, leaned back, and nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a business transaction that had gone as expected. But when the sentence came, even his mask faltered. 30 to 50 years in prison. The harshest ever given for such a charge. The press called it the fall of the American Caesar. Dewey became a national hero overnight, celebrated as the man who brought down the Mafia's invisible king. For Luciano it was humiliation, not because of the prison term but because of the manner of defeat. He had always believed that he could outthink anyone. But this time, intellect and composure weren't enough. The system he had built, clean, structured, rational, had been undone by emotion, perception, and politics. As guards led him out of the courtroom in handcuffs, reporters shouted his name. He turned briefly, gave a faint, ironic smile, and said, "Tell Dewey he can thank me for his next election." That single line captured everything about him: pride, defiance, irony. He understood that even in defeat, his name gave others power. In that moment, the underworld he had built began to fracture. Without his guiding hand, the commission struggled. Allies like Costello and Lansky tried to preserve his vision, but others like Genovese saw opportunity in his absence. Luciano was no longer a free man. But even behind bars his legend was growing. His fall was not an end, it was a transformation. The man who had once ruled without violence had become something larger than himself. A symbol, a myth, a ghost that still cast a shadow over every corner of organized crime. The trial had stripped him of freedom but not of influence. And soon, even from a prison cell, Lucky Luciano would find a way to remind the world that he was still in control. Prison was supposed to break Lucky Luciano, to strip him of influence, wealth, and the invisible authority that had defined him. But instead it became proof of how deeply his power ran. Even locked away behind stone walls, Luciano refused to fade. He couldn't walk the streets anymore, but the streets still answered to him. When Luciano arrived at Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, nicknamed Little Siberia for its freezing temperatures and isolation, he was no ordinary inmate. The guards knew his name, the warden knew his reputation, and the inmates, many of whom owed their livelihoods to his system, treated him like royalty. While others wore standard prison uniforms, Luciano made sure his looked cleaner, sharper. While others stood in line for food, he found ways to dine better. And while others served time, he conducted business. Inside, Luciano built a shadow government. Prisoners who had once worked the streets served as messengers. Letters, coded and disguised as innocent correspondence, moved in and out of the prison. He remained in quiet communication with Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and others still operating on the outside. The commission, his great invention, continued to function even without him physically present. Decisions were discussed, votes were cast, disputes were settled, all while their leader sat in a cell hundreds of miles away. Luciano had turned imprisonment into another layer of invisibility. The authorities believed they had neutralized him. In reality, they had given him a new vantage point. From behind bars, he could observe, advise, and control without exposing himself. His influence flowed through whispers, through coded language, through the unshakable loyalty of men who still referred to him simply as the boss. But maintaining power from prison wasn't just about communication, it was about psychology. Luciano understood that symbols mattered. As long as he acted like he was still in charge, people would continue to treat him that way. He never allowed himself to appear broken. He exercised daily, read constantly, studied politics and economics. When reporters occasionally interviewed him, he gave calm, reflective answers, portraying himself as a reformed businessman who had been misunderstood. It was all part of the illusion, control through perception. Outside, the Mafia was changing. World War II had reshaped global trade and smuggling routes, and Luciano's old networks were adapting. Lansky and Costello ran operations efficiently, but the threat of Vito Genovese loomed large. Genovese had fled to Italy to avoid prosecution, but his ambition had not cooled. He saw Luciano's imprisonment as temporary, an intermission before his own rise to power. Yet even from his cell, Luciano managed to counter Genovese's moves. Through trusted intermediaries, he made it clear that disloyalty would not be tolerated, that the empire he built still had eyes and ears everywhere. Men who betrayed him quietly disappeared, others returned to obedience. It was a silent, bloodless assertion of authority, the kind of power that needed no violence to be understood. Then, in 1942, an unexpected twist gave Luciano a new kind of relevance. The U.S. government, desperate to protect its harbors from Axis sabotage during the war, turned to an unlikely ally, the Mafia. Naval intelligence officers reached out through intermediaries to Meyer Lansky, who in turn connected them to Luciano. Despite being in prison, Luciano helped facilitate cooperation between organized crime and the U.S. Navy, ensuring that dockworkers, longshoremen, and gang-controlled unions kept the ports secure. In return, the government offered him leniency, or at least hope. It was an extraordinary irony. The man once branded as the face of corruption was now aiding the war effort. The project, later known as Operation Underworld, strengthened Luciano's myth. To some, it proved that he was more than a criminal, he was a strategist, a pragmatist, a patriot of convenience. Inside the prison, this arrangement gave Luciano even more leverage. Guards treated him with a wary respect. Other inmates deferred to him, sensing that he was no ordinary convict. When news of his cooperation with the government quietly spread, his legend only grew. Even the warden began to see him as something more than a prisoner. But beneath the poise and influence, Luciano was changing. Isolation had given him time to think about what he'd built and what it had cost. The calm mask he wore in public began to hide something heavier, the knowledge that no system, no matter how perfect, could escape entropy. The empire he had created was no longer his to command directly. Men he once trusted were now reshaping it in their own image. The world outside was moving on. Still, Luciano refused to vanish. From behind bars, he remained what he had always been, the quiet center of the storm, the unseen hand guiding the machine. His letters to Costello and Lansky grew increasingly philosophical. He spoke of balance, of business discipline, of the need for the Mafia to adapt without descending into chaos. It was as though he knew he was preparing them for a world that might no longer include him. After nearly a decade in prison, in 1946, his influence and wartime cooperation finally earned him a reward. New York's Governor, Thomas E. Dewey, the very man who had once destroyed him, signed off on his early release. The irony was almost cinematic. The prosecutor who had built his career by putting Luciano away now freed him, citing his extraordinary assistance during the war. But there was a condition: exile. Luciano was to be deported to Italy immediately. America, the empire he had built from its streets upward, would never again be his home. As he prepared to leave, the press swarmed. A reporter asked if he had any regrets. Luciano smiled faintly and said, "Everybody's got a boss. I just made it my business to find out who mine was." Even in defeat, he remained enigmatic, self-aware, almost philosophical. He had entered prison as a fallen king and left as something more elusive, a myth reborn. Luciano's time behind bars didn't end his reign, it redefined it. Power, he had learned, wasn't about presence, it was about permanence. And even in exile, Lucky Luciano's name would continue to rule a world he could no longer touch. When Lucky Luciano stepped off the ship in Naples in February 1946, he was 50 years old, and for the first time since boyhood, powerless. The docks were crowded with reporters and curious onlookers, eager to glimpse the man who had ruled America's underworld like a corporate emperor. But to the Italian authorities waiting to receive him, he was just another deportee, another foreign criminal sent home to rot. Italy, still scarred and starving in the aftermath of World War II, was a different world. Bombed-out buildings, black markets, and political instability had created a chaotic backdrop that both disgusted and fascinated Luciano. The land of his birth had no resemblance to the America he'd conquered. Yet beneath its ruin he saw something familiar: opportunity. He was greeted by whispers of respect and suspicion. Local bosses and smugglers saw him as a living legend, the man who had organized chaos into empire. The Italian government, on the other hand, saw him as a threat, a contagion from across the ocean. The police monitored him closely, restricting his movements and tracking his every contact. But surveillance meant little to a man like Luciano. He had spent his life mastering the art of influence without presence. Within months he had reconnected with old-world mafia figures, men who admired his American innovations and wanted to bring that level of organization to Italy's growing black market. In post-war Europe, everything was for sale: cigarettes, morphine, penicillin, even military supplies. Luciano began weaving himself into this network, quietly funding operations that spanned from Naples to Marseilles to New York. His fingerprints never appeared on a document, his name never on a ledger. But his methods, the efficiency, the hierarchy, the quiet discipline, echoed across the new criminal landscape. From the smuggling rings in southern Italy to the early heroin routes that would later flood America, Luciano's shadow lingered. He had been exiled physically, but his system was being globalized. Yet, for all his influence, Luciano felt something missing. Exile was not freedom, it was a slow death. He was cut off from his city, his streets, his friends. The very empire he had created, his true masterpiece, continued without him. Costello still pulled political strings in New York, Lansky managed finances and casinos in Havana, and Genovese, his old rival, had slithered back from Italy to reclaim his share of power. The world moved on, and Luciano for the first time could only watch. In Naples he lived like a retired monarch, surrounded by luxury but haunted by irrelevance. He spent his days walking along the waterfront, reading American newspapers, drinking espresso in quiet cafes. He stayed connected through coded letters and visits from old associates, but he was no longer the decision-maker. The power he once commanded now lived in stories, in the way men whispered his name in bars, in the way young criminals tried to imitate his calm. But exile brought reflection. For the first time he began to see his life as more than a series of victories and betrayals. Friends who visited him in those years described him as introspective, even philosophical. He spoke often of fate, of how power always comes with a price. "You spend your whole life making men afraid of you," he once said, and one day, you wake up and realize you're afraid of being forgotten. In 1947, Luciano's loneliness took him briefly to Cuba, a desperate attempt to reconnect with the pulse of his old world. There, with the help of Lansky, he began organizing meetings with American mobsters, discussing the future of their enterprises. It was an extraordinary sight, the exiled king gathering his court one last time. Havana's casinos glittered, deals were made, alliances renewed. But the U.S. government soon intervened, demanding that Cuba expel him. Within months he was back in Italy, his last real taste of America's underworld ripped away. The years that followed were quieter, slower. Luciano became a myth in real time, a relic from a vanished era of suits, cigars and silent deals. Younger gangsters revered him like a ghost, the man who proved that organization could outlive violence. But as age crept in, the past began to haunt him. Many of the people he had once trusted were gone, killed, imprisoned or turned by ambition. Costello, his oldest friend, was fading from power. Genovese, ever ruthless, had reclaimed dominance but turned the Mafia into something uglier, more violent. Luciano saw the new generation, brash, careless, greedy, and felt the quiet sting of disappointment. His empire, once ruled by logic and fear, had become chaotic again. In his final years he lived modestly in a seaside villa near Naples, often entertaining guests with stories from the old days. He had grown reflective but not repentant. He never apologized for what he'd done. He saw it as survival, evolution. "I didn't make crime," he once said. "I made it better." On January 26, 1962, Lucky Luciano died of a heart attack at the Naples airport. He was 64. He had just met with a producer who wanted to make a film about his life, a cinematic retelling of the legend he had become. As he walked out of the terminal, he clutched his chest, collapsed and was gone. Fittingly, his death was quiet. No bullets, no blood, just silence. The kind of silence he had always preferred. When his body was returned to New York, thousands attended the funeral. Men in dark suits lined the streets. Old gangsters stood beside politicians, movie stars, and ordinary New Yorkers who had lived their lives in the city Luciano once ruled. Even in death, he commanded reverence. Exile had stripped him of his empire, but not of his legacy. He had become a paradox. The gangster who ruled without rage, the exile who shaped global crime from afar, the man who discovered that power without presence could still outlast everything. Lucky Luciano's end wasn't a fall, it was a fade into myth. A quiet surrender to the one force even he couldn't control, time. And yet, decades later, his fingerprints still lingered on every shadowy deal, every silent handshake, every system built on fear disguised as order. He had once said that the trick to power was to make people believe it would never die. In that sense, even in exile, even in death, Lucky Luciano never truly left the stage. When Lucky Luciano died in 1962, the world didn't just lose a gangster, it lost the architect of an idea. He had not built his empire from bullets or fear, but from structure, vision, and a chilling kind of understanding about human nature. His death ended a life of contradictions, but the system he created, the modern Mafia, continued breathing long after his heart stopped. To understand his legacy, we must step beyond the stories of smuggling, gambling, and murder. Luciano's real genius wasn't in what he did, but in how he thought. He had turned crime into an institution, corruption into management, and fear into governance. In doing so, he created a legacy that would stretch across decades, shaping everything from organized crime to corporate strategy, and even modern politics. The America of the 1930s and 40s had been a breeding ground for crime, but Luciano gave it shape. Before him, the underworld was a scattered landscape of gangs and egos. After him, it became a network. Before him, the Mafia was a secret society bound by Sicilian superstition. After him, it was a multinational enterprise with rules, meetings, and profit margins. The cornerstone of his legacy was the commission, a word that would echo through every major Mafia family in America for generations. Established in 1931, it was Luciano's boldest idea, a governing council made up of the bosses of the most powerful families. It functioned not unlike a corporate board of directors, ensuring that disputes were settled with diplomacy rather than blood. For the first time, the Mafia had a mechanism for peace. This structure didn't just stabilize organized crime, it elevated it. Violence was now strategic, not impulsive. Killing became a last resort, not a reflex. Under Luciano's model, war was bad for business, and business was the new religion. It was revolutionary. And it worked. Law enforcement couldn't adapt fast enough. The old methods, following trails of violence and vendettas, no longer worked against an enemy that conducted itself like a boardroom. Detectives found themselves chasing ghosts. The Mafia was now invisible, its meetings held in private clubs, its communications veiled in coded language, its leaders insulated by layers of intermediaries. Luciano's vision was to create a system so disciplined it would run without him. And it did. For decades after his exile and death, the five families of New York operated under his principles. Even when new bosses rose, Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, Paul Castellano, they still bowed in some unspoken way to Luciano's ghost. His rules remained sacred. His model remained intact. But Luciano's influence wasn't limited to the criminal world. His way of thinking, pragmatic, emotionless, ruthlessly efficient, seeped into the broader culture of power itself. He taught that loyalty was currency, silence was strategy, and appearances were everything. He understood that fear wasn't about violence, it was about perception. To be feared was to be respected, but to be predictably feared was to be trusted. That's the paradox of Luciano's legacy. He made fear reliable. And that reliability is what made him powerful. Even in exile, when his physical empire was stripped away, he remained a symbol of control. Reporters, lawmen, even world leaders were fascinated by him. How had this man, an immigrant street hustler, managed to create a shadow government that rivaled the influence of Washington, D.C.? The answer lies in his psychology. Luciano was a master of human behavior. He knew when to listen, when to act, and, most importantly, when to wait. He once said, "A real boss don't gotta yell. The louder you talk, the weaker you are." He believed in subtlety and patience. While other gangsters built empires through brute force, Luciano built his through rhythm, a slow, deliberate orchestration of people and profit. This psychological mastery became his silent weapon. He understood that people didn't fear death, they feared uncertainty. And he used that fear masterfully. In meetings he rarely raised his voice. His calmness was unnerving, almost surgical. Men who expected rage were met instead with quiet reasoning. That quietness forced them to fill in the blanks themselves, to imagine what he might be thinking, what he might be planning. That imagination did more work than any gun ever could. He ruled not through threats, but through expectation. This kind of control reshaped the Mafia's image entirely. Gone were the reckless, hot-tempered street thugs. Under Luciano's blueprint, the new gangster was educated, well-dressed, discreet. They spoke softly, negotiated firmly, and treated crime like enterprise. Luciano had effectively legitimized illegitimacy. And his model didn't stay confined to New York. The commission structure was replicated in cities across America: Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Cleveland. It extended into Cuba, where Luciano's old allies established a criminal paradise under Batista's regime. It reached the Caribbean, where drug routes began to evolve under the same principles of efficiency and secrecy that he had perfected in the bootlegging days. By the 1950s, the world Luciano envisioned, an organized, global underworld, had become reality. He had laid the foundation for what would later become the international drug trade, money laundering networks, and offshore financial crime. He had, in a sense, invented globalization, through crime. Yet, as his influence spread, his philosophy was slowly diluted. The new generation of mobsters, men who never knew him personally, adopted his structure but abandoned his discipline. They wanted the glory without the restraint. They saw his empire as a stage, not a system. When television and Hollywood glamorized the gangster, the underworld began to believe its own myth. The suits got flashier, the cars louder, the violence more public. The calculated silence of Luciano's reign gave way to headlines and bloodshed. The very rules he had built to protect the Mafia became its forgotten commandments. And yet, even as his empire decayed, his image grew larger. Because Lucky Luciano was more than a man, he was an idea. He represented a timeless truth, that power, once structured, becomes immortal. His version of control didn't depend on loyalty alone, it depended on psychology. He created an atmosphere where betrayal felt impossible, where obedience felt natural. That was his real art. He didn't just command men, he designed environments that controlled them for him. It's a form of control still visible today, in corporations, politics, and systems of governance that reward silence and punish transparency. Luciano's principles survive in the way institutions protect themselves, in how organizations manage loyalty, and how leaders cultivate dependence. He was, unknowingly, the prototype for modern authority. Scholars have called him the Machiavelli of the mob, and not without reason. Like Machiavelli, he understood that fear and love were not opposites but tools, both necessary, both controllable. He maintained a delicate balance between them. His men admired him, feared him, and trusted him all at once. That combination made him untouchable. And it's that balance that defines his legacy. Lucky Luciano's story forces us to question the moral boundaries of intelligence. Can a mind so sharp that it brings order to chaos be considered evil? Or does genius, even when misused, carry its own strange nobility? He was not a sadist. He did not revel in violence. But he accepted it, as a function, as a necessity. That's what made him terrifying, not his cruelty but his rationality. He didn't kill for pleasure. He killed for process. To him, morality was an obstacle to efficiency. And efficiency was God. That mindset echoes through every modern system that values performance over ethics, results over humanity. Luciano's Mafia wasn't just a criminal network, it was a reflection of the century to come. Every time we see power cloaked in respectability, every time we witness corruption wearing the mask of order, we're seeing the shadow of Luciano's design. He taught the world that control doesn't require chaos, that tyranny can exist quietly, efficiently, with the illusion of civility. Perhaps that's why he still fascinates us. Because in his story, we recognize the uncomfortable truth about ourselves, that the human hunger for order often justifies the darkest compromises. He was, in every sense, the bridge between barbarism and civilization. He proved that a criminal could think like a statesman, and that the line between them was razor-thin. In the decades after his death, the FBI finally began to unravel the system he'd built. The commission cases of the 1980s, led by prosecutors like Rudy Giuliani, tore open the invisible web that Luciano had spun half a century earlier. Family after family fell, the Gambinos, the Luccheses, the Colombos, the Genoveses. But even as the arrests mounted, investigators couldn't help but marvel at how sophisticated the machine was. It had endured for over 50 years. And that endurance, more than the blood, more than the money, was the real proof of Luciano's genius. He once said, "There's no such thing as good money or bad money. There's just money." It's a statement that reveals everything. For Luciano, morality was irrelevant. The world, to him, was a game of systems, and he had mastered the rules. His ghost lives on not in violence but in logic. Every institution that values silence over truth, every hierarchy that sustains itself by keeping its members obedient and afraid, carries a trace of him. Lucky Luciano's true legacy isn't just the mafia. It's the modern concept of organized corruption. He turned crime into a business, but he also turned business into a kind of crime. And in that inversion he revealed something fundamental about human nature, that we are drawn to order, even when that order hides right underneath. That's why his story refuses to die. Because it isn't just about gangsters, it's about power itself. Luciano's empire was destroyed, his name vilified, and his body buried. But his idea, that power can be structured, sanitized, and sustained through control, became eternal. He didn't just rule an empire. He designed one that could live forever. That is the true legacy of Lucky Luciano, a man who ruled without violence, controlled without compassion, and taught the world that fear, when organized, is the most stable foundation of all. In the end, Lucky Luciano's story is not just the story of a gangster. It is the story of modern power, how it is built, how it is maintained, and how it destroys the very soul of the man who wields it. Luciano began life as a boy from the alleys of Palermo, chasing scraps in a world that never gave him anything. He grew up watching the powerful exploit the weak, the rich consume the poor, and the law serve whoever could afford it. By the time he crossed the Atlantic, he had already learned the lesson that would define his life. If justice could be bought, morality was irrelevant. And so he built his own system of justice, one based not on right or wrong but on order. Because for Luciano, order was everything. He had seen the chaos of street gangs, the madness of prohibition, the bloodbath of the Castellammarese War. He wanted to rise above it, not through compassion but through control. And control became his religion. Every decision, every alliance, every betrayal was made in service to that one God, control. It was control that made him powerful. It was control that made him feared. And ultimately, it was control that left him utterly alone. Luciano ruled by understanding what most men never do, that fear is a far stronger currency than love. Love makes people unpredictable. Fear makes them obedient. But there's a cost to ruling through fear. It isolates the ruler. The men who toasted him in public whispered about him in private. They respected him, yes, but they never trusted him. They couldn't. Because Luciano's greatest strength was also his greatest flaw. He saw people as pieces in a machine. Useful, replaceable, expendable. That mindset gave him power, but it stripped him of connection. The boy who once wanted to belong ended his life as a man who belonged to no one. Even in exile, when he had lost his empire and his freedom, Luciano could not escape the logic of his own creation. He still operated like a boss, giving orders to ghosts, organizing an empire that no longer existed. The world had moved on, but he was still trapped in his own machinery of control. And perhaps that is the truest tragedy of his life. He didn't build an empire to serve him. He built one that consumed him. Luciano had outsmarted everyone, except himself. The irony is breathtaking. The man who mastered the art of control died powerless. The man who never needed to raise his voice was silenced by time. The man who created an empire that could run without him was forgotten by the very machine he built. Yet even as the world moved on, his shadow lingered. Because what he created, the idea of organized crime, didn't vanish with his death. It evolved. It adapted. The Mafia survived not because of loyalty or violence, but because of structure. Luciano's structure. To this day, the echoes of his system can be found in every organized power dynamic, from corporations to governments to cartels. The names have changed, but the logic hasn't. Control, delegation, silence, and image, these were Luciano's commandments. And they have become the unspoken laws of modern authority. In that sense, Lucky Luciano didn't just shape the Mafia. He helped shape the 20th century. Because what is the modern world if not an organized chaos? A machine of deals, loyalties, betrayals, and silences. Luciano simply exposed the mechanics of it first. He was not the disease. He was the diagnosis. And that's what makes his story so haunting. Most criminals are cautionary tales. Luciano is something else entirely, a mirror. He reflects back to us our own obsession with control, with systems, with the illusion that order equals morality. He didn't just live outside the law, he recreated the law in his own image. That image endures because it feels familiar. We see it in boardrooms where men make decisions that ruin lives in the name of profit. We see it in governments that trade integrity for stability. We see it in every place where silence is rewarded and truth is punished. Luciano was not ahead of his time simply caught up to him. And that is the uncomfortable truth about his legacy, that the Mafia he built was not an aberration, but a reflection of the society that allowed it to thrive. He was the logical conclusion of a world that worships success and forgives everything else. Luciano never pretended to be a hero. But he also never pretended to be a monster. He lived in the gray where most of the world truly operates. That's what made him so dangerous and so enduring. He represented the genius of the immoral man, disciplined, intelligent, and utterly unburdened by guilt. In the decades after his death, as historians, filmmakers, and psychologists tried to decode him, one pattern became clear. Everyone saw what they wanted to see in Lucky Luciano. To some, he was a visionary, a man who brought order to anarchy. To others, he was the devil, a manipulator who corrupted an entire generation. But to those who looked closely, he was something simpler and far more human. A man who could not stop building even as the walls closed in around him. Luciano's genius was that he understood the architecture of power, the delicate balance between coercion and cooperation, fear and respect, secrecy and visibility. But his blindness was that he believed architecture could replace humanity. He could organize men. He could manipulate systems. But he could never truly connect. The more power he gained, the further he drifted from everything that made him human: friendship, trust, vulnerability. Even his closest allies, like Meyer Lansky, knew that beneath the charm, Luciano was unreachable. He smiled, he laughed, but there was a wall behind his eyes. That wall was built from years of survival, betrayal, and self-preservation. It protected him, but it also imprisoned him. And when he finally died, collapsing at the Naples airport, waiting to tell his own story through film, that wall came down only for a moment, long enough for the world to see the cost of a life lived in absolute control. For decades, people have romanticized him, the smooth, sharp-dressed king of the underworld who ruled without unnecessary bloodshed. But beneath that myth is a man whose life is a warning wrapped in allure. He proved that intelligence without empathy becomes tyranny. That discipline without conscience becomes corruption. And that order without morality is just another form of chaos, one that hides its cruelty behind structure. Lucky Luciano's name endures not because of what he did, but because of what he revealed. That the line between order and oppression, between control and captivity, is invisible until it's too late. His empire collapsed, but his philosophy survived, because it is the philosophy of every age that values power over principle. In that way, Luciano isn't just a figure from history, he's an eternal presence. He lives in the systems we build, in the compromises we justify, in the silence we keep when truth is inconvenient. He is the echo that asks, what would you sacrifice to maintain control? Because that was his secret all along. Control wasn't about wealth or fear or dominance. It was about removing uncertainty, from business, from people, from life itself. But life is uncertainty. And that's why his empire, for all its brilliance, was doomed. He built a machine to defeat chaos, and in the process he removed everything that made life worth living. Even his closest confidants, long after his death, spoke of a man who never stopped strategizing. They said that in conversation, Luciano was always 2 steps ahead, never present, always calculating. He couldn't turn it off. It wasn't an act, it was his nature. He had become the very system he built, efficient, precise, and soulless. That is the final paradox of Lucky Luciano. He ruled without violence, but his rule was violence of another kind, psychological, systemic, invisible. He didn't kill for pleasure, but his logic killed empathy, trust, and friendship just as effectively. He didn't destroy lives out of hatred. He did it out of necessity. And that's what makes him terrifying. Because the most dangerous kind of evil isn't chaotic, it's rational. And Luciano was the embodiment of rational evil. In the twilight of his life, exiled in Naples, he was often seen walking alone through the narrow streets, wearing his immaculate suits, watching the world that had outgrown him. To the locals he looked like a dignified old man. To those who knew his story he was a ghost, the last relic of a vanished empire. He was both proud and haunted. He knew he had changed history, but he also knew he would never be free from it. His empire had made him immortal, but his immortality came with solitude. And so he lived quietly, surrounded by memories and photographs, his only company the ghosts of men who once obeyed him. He never married, never had children, never truly trusted another human being. He had built a dynasty, but left no heir. That is the loneliness of power. When he finally died that winter afternoon in 1962, the newspapers wrote headlines that sounded almost reverent. End of an era. The last dawn. The man who made the Mafia. It was as if the world itself couldn't decide whether to condemn him or commemorate him. His funeral was a spectacle. Hundreds came, from old gangsters to curious citizens. Some mourned him. Most came simply to see him one last time, lying in his casket like a fallen monarch. Even in death he commanded attention. Even in silence he ruled the room. But if we strip away the myth, what remains is not a legend, it's a lesson. Luciano's life is a meditation on the nature of power itself. How it begins as protection, transforms into control, and ends as isolation. His story is proof that power, once achieved, demands sacrifice, and that the higher you climb, the less of yourself you can afford to keep. He believed that fear was the foundation of stability. And for a time he was right. His empire thrived because people feared to disobey him. But fear, like all currencies, devalues over time. When his name no longer inspired it, his power vanished. That is the fate of every empire built on fear. It lasts only as long as the echo of its master's voice. And yet, his ideas survive, because they speak to something deeply human. The desire to control. The fear of uncertainty. The belief that if we can just organize the chaos, we can live forever. Lucky Luciano chased immortality through order, and in a way he found it. His system lives on not just in crime, but in every hierarchy that values control more than conscience. That is his true legacy. Not the crimes. Not the money. But the method. He showed the world that domination doesn't need brutality. That fear doesn't need shouting. That power doesn't need blood. It just needs obedience. And so, the story of Lucky Luciano ends not with redemption, but with revelation. He was not a hero. He was not even truly a villain. He was something far more complex. The man who proved that control can be the most seductive and the most destructive form of freedom. The boy from Sicily became the architect of American crime. The outcast became a king. The king became a ghost. And through it all, the question remains, was he truly lucky, or simply inevitable? Because maybe the truth is this: Lucky Luciano didn't create the world he ruled. He simply understood it better than anyone else. And that, in the end, was the real fear he created.